Okay, here's a quick test you can do on your carburetor from whether it's your lawnmower, generator, pressure washer. So if you're experiencing an issue where either you're getting fuel in the oil, or you got fuel that seems to spill out of like the air box, that shouldn't be happening because there's the float system inside the carburetor. Now, this is just a quick way to test if that needle is seating properly, which would then cut off your fuel supply into the carburetor. And if it's not functioning properly, that's one solid reason why it would be overflowing. Now, you saw in the previous video that we had a carburetor where the bowl was at, or not the bowl, sorry, the float was actually cracked. It's not overly common. So if you've got fuel leaking out of your lawnmower or any of your small equipment, first thing I would do is obviously pinch the fuel line off, or close the fuel valve, get the carburetor off, and open up the carb. If you don't notice any issues with the float and it doesn't seem cracked and there's no fuel in it, if there's fuel in the float, then you know that's not good, obviously. But if you don't have fuel in the float, then odds are you're dealing with a bad needle and seat. So what you can do is, I'm just going to set this on top of the generator from the previous video. All you got to do is just undo the bowl nut. I've already hooked a fuel line up to the intake. I always keep a spare clean fuel line on hand just to do the testing with. I don't want to be using one that had gas in it, because you'll end up blowing into this end of the hose. So you pull the bowl nut off, and this was a carburetor that I'd cleaned up a bit. Now, normally that float, when there's no fuel in it, will be all the way down like this. As the fuel level rises in the bowl, this float moves up, and as it moves up, it's closing off the needle down there. It's pushing the needle into the seat, which then closes off the fuel from coming into the intake here. So basically what you can do is, if you hold the float up like this and you blow into this end of the line, you blow into the hose here, with the float up, if you hear air coming through, that's fine. It should come through because the float is basically in the down position. Now, keep blowing air into the carburetor and push the bowl or the float in, simulating the fuel level rising in the bowl. It should cut off the airflow coming into it. So it should sound like something like this. So there you go. You can actually hear that the needle is not seating properly in this carburetor, and this is actually the reason I kept this one, because it's kind of a good demonstration. I had pulled this off I can't remember what it was now. You know what? I think this came off a pressure washer. And that was the issue, is that it was leaking fuel. Now, because of the angle that this was mounted on the pressure washer, it wasn't actually leaking into the intake, and it didn't end up putting fuel into the crankcase, but it was just spilling fuel basically out of the air box, soaked the air filter, and just made a mess. So, I mean, these needles, I'll pull the float out. These needles are actually a wear item on these carburetors anyways. So, I mean, it's natural over time for these things to wear down and basically not seat properly. And now it's probably super hard to see. Let's see if I can get it to focus. You can see around the needle, see that darker black ring, maybe about halfway down. That's actually enough to cause the needle to not seat properly. And that's what our culprit would be. Something I'll do sometimes just to see if I can get it to actually seat is I'll put a bit of oil on this. But it's not a permanent solution because the gas just washes it right off. But sometimes that's just another way I can verify that the needle isn't seating properly, because with a little bit of oil, it'll actually allow it to seat and it'll seal off temporarily. But you know, if you've got air coming through and you're pushing this float down to where the needle should be seating and you can hear air coming through, then this is going to be your culprit. And ultimately, even though your engine may be running with a bad needle, it's ultimately going to result in the carburetor flooding. And if your fuel tank sits higher than your carburetor, which in this case it would, most likely, then you're just going to end up having too much fuel going into the intake, and most times it'll actually cause the engine to not even start altogether. So anyways, if that's an issue you're dealing with, this is certainly the first thing I would check. Like I said, if the bowl, or sorry, I keep calling this a bowl. If the float is not cracked, then, and you've got fuel leaking out of the carburetor, the only other explanation is it's going to be the needle in the seat isn't working, or a less common issue would actually be the vent. Now you can see this hole right here. This is actually the carburetor vent for the bowl. Basically, as fuel level rises, when this bowl is empty, that air has to go somewhere, and that air comes out here, which is on the throttle side, and that air just ends up getting drawn into the engine. There's vapor in it too, so it's just going to burn off. But I haven't had it personally happen, but basically if I were to plug this vent here, what would happen is, this is another reason this is how it causes your carburetor to flood. If the vent is plugged, as fuel's entering through the needle, that air has nowhere to go. So the air gets trapped all the way around this cylinder here for the main jet. The air gets trapped all around this, and it can't vent out. So even fuel is going to keep entering the bowl because that float can't go all the way up. And the float's not going all the way up because the fuel level in and around this main jet isn't actually rising. Basically what's happening is it's like an airlock, and as the fuel's entering, the only place the fuel can go is up through the main jet. So what'll happen is you'll have an airlock around or above your float, and because there's not much fuel in the bowl, your float won't rise to close off the fuel on the needle and seat, and you're going to have fuel continuously entering, but it just basically trickles up the main jet through the emulsion tube and into the venturi part of the carburetor, and it just floods, and you'll have basically a flooded engine or fuel coming out of your airbox. All three of these would create the same symptoms, essentially. So whether it's a crack in your bowl, no, not your bowl, a crack in the float, a bad needle and seat, or a plugged vent. And the simplest way to, I mean, you pull the bowl off, you'll know right away if there's a crack in the float, because there's going to be fuel in it, most likely. And you can quickly check the vent by just blowing some compressed air through, and whether you blow it through this end or that end on the inside, it's probably easier to blow it through this end here, and then you're going to have the air coming out down through here. And if you see debris come out of there, it's quite possible that could have also been the issue, or maybe contributing to the issue. So that's always a good sign. I mean, that's the simplest of fixes, right? You don't want a bad needle and seat because then you're replacing components, and you don't want a bad float because then you're replacing components. But this would be the simplest fix, is if you blew out the vent and you get a little bit of debris come out of there, that could be the issue. And at that point, if everything else checks out, it's worth reassembling and trying it again. But that's basically, those are my three go-to items when I'm troubleshooting a carburetor that's flooding on, this would be for 4-stroke equipment. 2-stroke equipment, their carburetors do function similar, but there's a bunch of gaskets and diaphragms in there, and to be honest, I don't even fully understand all of it yet. But there's still a needle and seat on those as well, and they're also a wear item, so sometimes that can happen as well, where the needle's not seating properly and it just ends up flooding the carburetor. So anyways, yeah, if you guys have any questions, just feel free to comment them. Happy to help as much as I can. But yeah, I'm still learning a lot about all this stuff, and pretty much learning something new every day here. And yeah, it's kind of fun. You know, you don't realize how complicated this stuff is. Engines are so simple yet so complicated. You realize it's such a small component can cause something to not work properly.